welcome to Speaking Freely with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Hoover, your host and Director of Communications at the ACLU of PA. In February, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro announced that he would continue the moratorium on executions started by his predecessor, Tom Wolf. Shapiro also went a step further than Wolf, calling on the legislature to repeal the death penalty in its entirety. Marc Bookman is the executive director of the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation, a former attorney in the homicide unit of the Defender Association of Philadelphia, and the author of A Descending Spiral, Exposing the Death Penalty in 12 Essays. In this conversation, Marc explains just how dysfunctional capital punishment is in Pennsylvania and why, despite 2 decades since the last execution, the death penalty is very real in the Commonwealth. This conversation was recorded on May 16th. Well, Marc Bookman, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's really great to talk with you. We've worked together for years and great to have you here.
Thank you for asking me, Andy.
So, Book, first of all, tell me about the Atlantic Center. What does your organization do?
So the Atlantic Center, we formed it 13 years ago. Our slogan then and now is trying to put ourselves out of business since 2010. We are kind of an all-purpose agency, small nonprofit, independent, trying to help anyone facing the death penalty. And that normally would be a pretrial, but sometimes direct appeals, sometimes post-conviction, and just really trying to offer whatever services we can. A lot of consultation, a lot of trainings of lawyers, but also some direct representation and some systemic representation. So a little bit of everything.
Yeah, the full title is Atlantic Center for Capital Representation. I know you work a lot with defense attorneys and trying to train folks in proper practices. It has been 24 years since there was an execution in Pennsylvania. And the thing that I've noticed is that leads people to believe mistakenly that the death penalty doesn't exist here. It just doesn't quite, I'm in a lot of criminal justice circles, criminal legal reform circles, and the death penalty just is down the list. Can you explain why the view that there really isn't a death penalty in Pennsylvania is wrong? Capital punishment is very much alive and unwell in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so, we don't have to look far to figure out what's wrong with the kind of the hypothesis that the death penalty is not real in Pennsylvania. All we have to do is look to the federal system. So, the feds had not executed anyone in I guess it was 15 years. It might have been more than that, 17 or 18 years. And then Donald Trump comes along and executes 13 people in 7 months, including a number of people after he had lost an election. But before he was removed from office. And so Pennsylvania, we may seem like we don't have a death penalty. Actually, I think the last count we had was 56 pretrial capital cases. That's 56 cases where the prosecutor has notified the defense formally that they're seeking the death penalty. So, you may think to yourself, well, we've had a moratorium. We haven't had any executions. The only executions we had were involuntary executions. But prosecutors continue to seek the death penalty on a very, very regular basis, more than almost any other state. So it's real.
I never would have guessed that number. I mean, I've looked at the year-to-year death sentence number, and that tends to be fairly low. It tends to be in like the 4 to 6 range, but 56 pretrial cases right now, that's wild.
Yeah, it's that our numbers yearly are even lower than that, but I attribute, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, first of all, jurors and the community is kind of wising up to the death penalty, and I'm sure we're going to get a chance to talk about that. And I think legal teams have gotten better at ways to avoid the death penalty. Legal teams shouldn't have to do that. The death penalty should not be used as a tool by the prosecution. Even if you believed in the death penalty, it should only be for the select few of the really worst kinds of cases. Obviously, 56 is a number that does not reflect the true worst of the worst cases in Pennsylvania.
Well, you say that using it as a tool for the prosecution, that actually was going through my head. That, I mean, do you think that it's really in some cases, maybe a lot of cases, the DAs are using it as a bargaining chip to get someone to plea?
So I did a public affairs presentation for a station in Lancaster County. I should remember which one, but I don't. And so I did my segment live, but they had two videotaped segments by two senators in Pennsylvania. One of them started off the program by saying, if we didn't have a death penalty, we would never get pleas. That's totally unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. But it's one of those kind of rare moments where a politician actually says what's on his or her mind, and what's on his mind was an unconstitutional use of the death penalty.
Well, and that's parallel to something we've talked about in our other criminal legal reform work at the ACLU, which is in non-homicide cases, other types of cases where charges get stacked and people end up pleading out because if they risk going to trial. But then, like you said, it's unconstitutional. It's I don't know if that practice could actually be called unconstitutional, but in practice, the person is giving up their right to a trial by jury because the DA just puts on 3, 4, 5 charges, and it puts the person in a position like, well, I guess I had to accept the best deal they give me.
In a non-capital context, it may not be unconstitutional, but it's certainly immoral. Charge someone with what you think they did. Don't overcharge. Right. That's coercive in the worst possible way.
Yeah. So since the death penalty was reinstated in Pennsylvania, which was in 1978, there have been 3 executions. They were all in the 1990s. They were all of people who had mental health disabilities and gave up their legal appeals. Meanwhile, there have been 11 people who were exonerated after being sentenced to death. How does that happen? How do innocent people end up getting the death sentence?
So Pennsylvania is unique in one really, really unfortunate way. We give no money for indigent defense. The state provides no money for indigent defense. So every county is fending for itself, and some counties believe that they should have a fairly resourced criminal justice system, and other counties want to scrimp and save every penny they can. And so you end up with a state of untrained, unconsulted, uncounseled, under-resourced lawyers handling these cases. You're going to have that kind of injustice. The RAND study out of Philadelphia showed, I'll just skim over it, but the RAND study showed that well-trained, resourced lawyers in the Philadelphia Public Defender's Office were delivering far better results for their clients than under-resourced, court-appointed lawyers were. And that's just fundamentally unfair, and it's easily resolved. Governor Shapiro asked for $10 million for indigent defense in his budget, and it made news. Well, $10 million is a drop in the bucket, right? Yeah. And that made news. So imagine if he really wanted to fund indigent defense the way some states fund it, it would make big news. It's an easy fix that we refuse to take.
Yeah, we compiled the total budgets of 66 counties, not including Philadelphia, since their system's a bit different. But and the total of those 66 counties for their public defenders' offices is about 126 million. So, and that is not enough, as you've described. I mean, some of we know of counties where they have vacancies in their PD offices, and the salaries are so low that lawyers don't want to go there to work. And you compare 126 million to 10 million the governor has proposed. You're right. 10 million is merely a start.
Yes. And so, when you look at the statistics you cited, the three voluntary executions, not involuntary, they volunteered, they gave up their appeals, and then the 11 exonerations, both of those are a direct reflection of ineffective lawyering. the 3 execution, normally you'd think with a row as big as ours, there'd be many more executions, but the lawyering is so ineffective that almost all those cases have been reversed. So, it's penny wise and pound foolish. We're spending this money. We're getting no results for it. We are getting a certain amount of injustice, though, a large amount, which is 11 exonerations. And that's frankly a tip of the iceberg. There are more to come.
Yeah, and another key data point here for people to understand is this. Since 1978, more than 300 people sentenced to death in Pennsylvania have won their legal appeals with either their sentence or their conviction overturned. What are the patterns here? What are the most common errors in capital cases?
Well, we've already talked about one. Ineffective lawyering is certainly a big issue. And look, you can blame the lawyers. I blame the state because the state has an obligation to properly fund and resource train these lawyers to do a better job. But there's other causes. There's regrettable other causes. There's a significant amount of prosecutorial misconduct. We see it over and over again. Just in Philadelphia, for years and years and years, there was a kind of a way of thinking in the prosecutor's office that said, do anything to win. And of course, that's not the prosecutor's job. But so we see, between bad defense lawyering and extensive prosecutorial misconduct, those are certainly the 2 big causes.
Well, and the impact, you've mentioned the public defenders and the lack of funding for public defenders. So obviously the people who are most impacted here are going to be folks who don't have means,
Yes.
folks who don't have, the number I've always heard over the years since I've been involved in this issue that gets thrown around is that 90% of people on death row in Pennsylvania could not afford a private attorney. Don't know if that number still sticks. I don't know if you have that data.
Yeah, it may not be 90%, but it's not far from 90%. That's for sure. And but it's not just public defenders, Andy. It's also, we're paying court-appointed lawyers an absurdly low amount of money to handle serious cases. And so, when you're paying a minimal amount of money, you're going to get a minimal amount of services a lot of times. We're also not getting the best lawyers because the best lawyers are not going to work for, $80, $90 an hour.
Yeah. And knowing income inequality issues and the impacts on race, as well as the fact that so many cases are from Philadelphia, there's a racial component here too, right?
The racial component is overt and maybe, obvious to those of us who work in the system. First of all, when you have a system that is dealing extensively with people of color, and then you don't properly fund the defense function, that in itself is clearly racist, right? You're not, try to imagine a bunch of kids from the Philadelphia suburbs having lawyers that don't visit them, that don't file motions, that don't ask for jury questionnaires. That's a horrible system. It wouldn't last 5 minutes because the suburbs would revolt with those kinds of services. So our whole system is racist in the way that it approaches justice. But then, of course, the death penalty kind of exacerbates that in a lot of ways. The race of the victim, and so forth. So, the one thread that goes through almost every issue regarding the death penalty is racism.
So this year, ACLU-PA is going to be educating our members and supporters and anyone we can reach about the importance of the state Supreme Court. In November, we'll be electing a new justice to the court, and the court's impact on criminal law is going to be one of the areas that ACLU-PA will be talking about. Tell me about your own experience in front of that court. What role does the Pennsylvania Supreme Court play in both enforcing and limiting the death penalty?
Yeah, so the most important thing to think about when you're thinking about the death penalty in Pennsylvania is you got to take a good hard look at the United States Supreme Court, right? So, there was a time, it's come and gone, but there was a time when people looked at the United States Supreme Court as at least somewhat of a backstop, that if things were really outrageous, you could count on the United States Supreme Court to step in. I've never been a big fan of the United States Supreme Court either, I have to admit, but it's never been as desperately awful as it is right now. Trump said what he was going to do, and he did it. He put 3 judges on the Supreme Court that they wouldn't know injustice if it ran them over with a truck in the middle of the road. Mm-hmm. So my point here is there are state constitutional issues and federal constitutional issues, and the state oftentimes can prevail if the court wants it to. And so very, very important, and for any of the lawyers out there, I'm sure they all know this, to raise state constitutional issues. So, in a time when our United States Supreme Court is really not stepping up to the plate for purposes of justice, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is just critically important. My own experience with the Supreme Court, well, win some, lose some, but the Pennsylvania Constitution right now is extremely important. And there are big cases coming up there soon involving the death penalty thing.
Well, and maybe one of the most high-profile situations in recent years was when Governor Wolf implemented his moratorium, and then the DAs sued to try to stop the moratorium, and the state Supreme Court, I think it was unanimous, if I remember correctly, ruled in the governor's favor. But so many, cases go up and down there so often, and unless you live in the county where the case happens, you're probably never going to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Governor Wolf was obviously very brave in what he did, but other governors have done it as well. Colorado, Oregon. Now we've got Governor Shapiro. Let's just hold him off for a minute. The 56 cases I talked about, those are all discretionary, right? So in other words, people may not know what's happening in their county. If you live in Washington County, which has less than 2% of the population in Pennsylvania, there are 14 capital cases in Washington County. And then there's other counties where they haven't seen a capital prosecution in decades because they don't think it's necessary for their justice system. So Governor Wolf comes along, he brings about a moratorium, and he says, look, we've got a lot of problems. I'm not going to execute anyone until these problems are addressed. Of course, our legislature doesn't address any of them. In the bipartisan study that came out, they laid out a whole bunch of problems. Our legislature didn't touch any of them. Yeah. Now Governor Shapiro comes along and I think logically says, one, no one's done anything to improve this system, but two, his own thinking in his own words has evolved. And so, one of the things that I think is that I've always thought is that if the public knew the facts, they wouldn't support the death penalty. Yeah, it's just getting the facts out there. That's the heart. People have to hear it. So Governor Shapiro, when he says I evolved, that makes perfect sense to me because I think he learned the facts a little bit. He familiarized himself with the issues, moral and legal. So I give him a world of credit.
Well, and I feel like from some of the research we've been doing recently on some other issues, it does feel like the messaging about the problems of the criminal legal system writ large is getting through. People are recognizing the flaws, and to me, the death penalty just comes with in a lot of ways it is unique because of the way the capital system works, but many of the same problems that exist elsewhere in the criminal legal system exist with the death penalty. And it's a slow process, but hopefully we get there politically.
Well,
I know you're more, I always think of you as more of a legal mind, but if you have thoughts on the politics of it, I'd be curious to hear that too.
let me just say this, that I don't know if this is kind of between politics and legal maybe, but I think that the innocence revolution, the DNA revolution, has taken us very, very far along helping people understand the frailties of the system. But I fear that we focus, and this is not going to win me any friends in the innocence community, but I fear that our focus on just innocence oftentimes misses the boat. Having someone on trial for their life, if their lawyer is sleeping through trial or drunk or high, or frankly, without the necessary tools to properly represent that, that's an injustice.
Right.
We can't just look at innocence here. There is a certain fundamental unfairness to the death penalty, especially the way we're handling it these days. And so I don't want innocence to take us away from these other, what I like literally think are fundamental injustices. From a political point of view, I guess I mentioned earlier how I had done this public affairs presentation. One of the senators said that he wanted to leverage pleas with the death penalty. The other one said he wanted a mandatory death penalty for police killings. Now, a mandatory death penalty is unconstitutional also. The law is crystal clear on this. So politically, I think our politicians are behind the public. In other words, for decades, you could get somewhere being quote unquote tough on crime about the death penalty. Those days are gone. But we still got a certain percentage of politicians thinking that they can still make hay with the death penalty. And maybe in some jurisdictions they can, certainly not Philadelphia. Larry Krasner was clear about his perspective on the death penalty. He used a phrase I loved. He said, supporting the death penalty was akin to lighting money on fire, just throwing it away. And certainly Pennsylvania has shown that over the last 50 years with what we've gotten for the money we've spent. So politically, my own perspective is some of these politicians don't know the facts, and they still think that this is a winning issue for them when that ship has sailed. I don't think it's a winning issue anymore.
I completely agree. I mean, I think you look at some of the electoral outcomes, and we're talking probably at least 9 years worth of outcomes here. In 2014, Tom Wolfe filled out a candidate questionnaire where he said he would support a moratorium on executions. And Tom Corbett never said a word about it. I think if Scott Wagner mentioned it in 2018, he barely mentioned it. It never came up in the Shapiro race this past year.
And of course, Governor Wolfe, after imposing the moratorium, won easily again.
Right, exactly. And then this isn't death penalty specific, but it is related. The Fetterman Oz race, where John Fetterman is sitting as the chair of the pardons board, openly advocating to get people out who have life sentences. Oz hits him with everything he has, and Fetterman still wins.
Yeah.
I just feel I 100% agree with you that the politicians are behind the times.
Yeah. And it's painful. I mean, Fetterman was so right about now we're off the death penalty subject a little bit, but there are so many people in prison who just don't need to be there anymore. Yeah. They've been punished significantly and they've outgrown their behavior, and it's time to take a careful look at a lot of folks. The one thing that the juvenile resentencings taught us, all the juveniles that were sentenced to life and then got resentenced, the one thing we learned, the one thing the public learned, people in the business knew this for all the years, they didn't need to be in custody anymore. They just, that recidivism rate is very, very low for those folks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you have written a book, A Descending Spiral, Exposing the Death Penalty in 12 Essays. I've read some of it. I've read some of these essays. Some of them I read when they were originally published in various places. That was published. The book was published 2 years ago. Tell me a little bit about the book. Any particular stories that stand out? Anything that you came away with, you want readers to come away with from it?
So I started writing these essays thinking that I would write like an essay per issue, like an essay about prosecutorial misconduct, an essay about a racist judge, an essay about bad defense lawyering, and so forth. And so there are 12 essays in the book. If there's one takeaway, and I write this in the afterword, it's please don't think that I cherry picked these essays. That was my one. Like, I didn't write about O.J. Simpson. I didn't write about Scott Peterson. I didn't write about the stories that kind of, for what one reason or another, the press gloms onto. The important thing for me is for the public to recognize that these stories are typical. They don't stand out from the crowd. You write a story about bad lawyering, there are 50 other stories that I could have picked about bad lawyering. You write a story about a prosecutor hiding evidence, 50 stories I could have picked for that topic. So it's the tip of the iceberg. That's the metaphor I use, and I'll stand by it.
All right, Book. Well, where can folks go to learn more about the Atlantic Center?
Well, the best place to go is our website, which somehow we got this name. I don't know how we got it, but it's atlanticcenter.org. So, I think there's probably a decent number of Atlantic Centers out there, but we have the website, atlanticcenter.org, and that we are a small nonprofit. We depend on donations to do our work. All the money goes to services. So would love people to take a look at atlanticcenter.org.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks, Book. Really appreciate your time and appreciate your insights.
Andy, really, thank you for having me.
That's Marc Bookman, Executive Director of the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation. Find the Atlantic Center online at atlanticcenter.org and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you enjoy the conversations that you hear on Speaking Freely and believe in the work of the ACLU, you should be a member. Join us by visiting aclupa.org/join. That brings episode 82 to a close. The editor of Speaking Freely is Natalie Montero. Our opening theme is by Moody Finn, and our closing theme is by Elliot. Both are courtesy of bensound.com. The acting executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania is Claire Landau. I'm Andy Hoover. Until next time, be free.